Week 8 of the 2024 fantasy football season is here, and we need to break down 10 things that you need to know before you set your starting lineups for Week 8 of 2024 fantasy football. Let's kick the video off with the fact that Bryce Young will be starting at the quarterback position for the Carolina Panthers today. And that doesn't really feel like good news for Chuba Hubbard and company. When we go back and look at Chuba Hubbard through the first 2 weeks of the season when Bryce Young was the starting quarterback for the Panthers, 1.4 fantasy points against the Saints in Week 1, 11.6 in Week 2 against the Chargers. Not too bad, probably got you through the week, but he added 4 receptions in that game off of 5 targets and had 64 yards on the ground. So, I mean, without those receptions, not a great game. Then we look forward to the past couple weeks when Andy Dalton has been the starting quarterbacks. 11.2 fantasy points last week against Washington and what was essentially a blowout. But outside of that, 15.3 or more fantasy points in every other start with Andy Dalton at the quarterback position. So we had the Denver Broncos giving up the 11th fewest fantasy points to the running back position so far on the season. Pat Surtain is back this week. Deontay Johnson's out for the Panthers. Adam Thielen's still out for the Panthers. We got Xavier Leggett in his rookie season lining up as the wide receiver 1. This just does not feel like a good offensive potential day for the Panthers on the road against one of the best defenses in the league, especially with Bryce Young at the starting quarterback, and I didn't really feel great going into the week with Andy Dalton as a starting quarterback who has struggled in the past 2 weeks, at least in terms of turnovers, but certainly struggled last week as the entire offense did against Washington. So if you own Chuba Hubbard, I know he's been great, averaging 15.3 fantasy points per game so far on the season. But here in Week 8, if you have better options, you have other options that you might prefer or who have better matchups for the week, I think this is a week where we're going to have to strongly consider sitting Chuba Hubbard as we approach Week 8. The next thing that you need to know is that Jayden Daniels is still listed as questionable going into today's matchup against the Chicago Bears as he deals with that rib injury. So what do we do with some of these offensive starters for the Washington Commanders? Well, I think this is still a good enough matchup for Brian Robinson Jr. that he is startable if Marcus Mariota is the starting quarterback. And if you're rolling with Zach Ertz, I mean, he's still got plenty of volume with Marcus Mariota starting last week, so I think he's probably okay. But then we look at Terry McLaurin. I mean, this is already a tough matchup, even if Jayden Daniels does play today, with the Chicago Bears giving up the 6th fewest fantasy points to the wide receiver position so far on the season. So I do worry about Terry McLaurin today. He is another player who I don't know that we outright have to bench this week, but that I just don't feel 100% confident in if we see Marcus Mariota as the starting quarterback today. Jalen Johnson's one of the best starting corners in the NFL. He's going to be lined up on Terry McLaurin this entire game. This could certainly mean bad news for Terry McLaurin. I mean, even if Jayden Daniels starts, I don't know that we're going to see a super high ceiling out of Scary Terry today, but if Marcus Mariota is the starter for the Commanders today, similar to Chuba Hubbard here, I think we have to look at other options for your wide receiver 2 spot or your flex spots if you own Terry McLaurin today. I think he's an okay start if Jayden Daniels is the starting quarterback today and is able to play through that rib injury. But if Mariota is the starter today, I just don't prefer Terry McLaurin. I know he's been great, especially in the past couple games as that offense, in terms of their passing game, has really started to get rolling. He's averaging 14.7 fantasy points per game, and it's not like he was that bad last week with 15.8 fantasy points against the Panthers with Mariota playing essentially that entire game. Still had 6 targets, 6 receptions, 98 receiving yards, but this is a much steeper matchup here with the Chicago Bears in Week 8. So if you have other options and Jayden Daniels does have to sit here in Week 8, I would consider playing those other options over Terry McLaurin today. All right, next thing that you need to know that I've talked a lot about throughout the week is that the Jacksonville Jaguars just cannot stop the tight end position, and that makes Tucker Kraft a must-start player today. Look at last week. Hunter Henry, 9 targets, 8 receptions, 92 receiving yards, 17.2 fantasy points against the Jaguars. We go to the week before. Look at Cole Kmet, 5 targets, 5 receptions, 70 receiving yards, 2 touchdowns, 24 total fantasy points. I know that Tucker Kraft's overall volume has been a little bit difficult to trust. I mean, we really take away the 4 touchdowns over the past 4 weeks. We're not left with a ton. We look at last week, for example, 4 targets, 3 receptions, 11 receiving, or excuse me, 33 receiving yards, 11 receiving yards per catch, but just 1 touchdown. So 3 receptions, 1 touchdown, 12.3 fantasy points. You know, it's a little worrisome if we take away the touchdown, to say the least. We're probably looking at a similar stat line to week 6, where he had 4 targets, 2 catches, 13 receiving yards, 0 touchdowns, and just 3.5 fantasy points, right? But Tucker Kraft, at the end of the day, is the tight end 3 so far on the season, averaging 10.2 fantasy points. A lot of you guys who own him are going to start him anyways, but I've seen a lot of rosters who are looking at Tucker Kraft as their tight end 2 or their tight end 3. You have other options like Evan Ingram, Jake Ferguson. I mean, it's actually starting to look like the tight end position is coming to life here at the midpoint in the season. But if you own Tucker Kraft, don't ignore this matchup against the Jaguars. Overall, one of the worst defenses in the entire league. And overall, they are getting torched by the tight end position. Do not bench Tucker Kraft this week. He's a great start at the tight end spot. And dare I say, Tucker Kraft is also flexible as we move into week 8. And in similar fashion, we absolutely have to start Jordan Love, as the Jaguars are giving up the most fantasy points to the quarterback position so far on the season. Once again, let's just look at the past 2 weeks. Drake May, in his second NFL start, 20 fantasy points in week 7 against the Jags, 26 of 37, 276 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns. The week before, Caleb Williams absolutely sliced and diced this defense for a fantasy stat line high on the season of 29.6 fantasy points, 4 passing touchdowns, 226 passing yards, 23 of 29, 56 rushing yards. And now enters Jordan Love, who's been fantastic all season long. For a lot of you guys, it's just the quarterback you're going to start anyways. But once again, this is a player, especially due to the injury, that we're seeing coming on a lot of rosters where there's another option at the quarterback position. But he's averaging 22.2 fantasy points per game. If he hadn't missed weeks 2 and 3, Jordan Love could easily be a top 5 fantasy quarterback right now. And this matchup is just ridiculously good. I know they're on the road here, but the Packers are going to come out strong offensively. If you own Jordan Love, under no circumstances, unless like maybe you have Lamar Jackson or maybe a healthy Jayden Daniels, but outside of that, under no circumstances are you benching Jordan Love against the Jaguars in week 8. I would be flying over to Underdog to take the over on Jordan Love's total passing yards, sitting at just 219.5 passing yards. This is an absolute smash, as he has hit that in every single start so far on the season. And now he plays the Jaguars, giving up the most fantasy points to the quarterback position so far on the season. An atrocious secondary. This is a smash line for Jordan Love. Don't forget, guys, all new users who sign up with promo code TheCatch on Underdog are getting a free NFL Pick Em for the week. Take your free Pick Em, pair it with Jordan Love to hit the over on his passing yards, and once that hits, you're going to automatically triple your cash entry. And on top of that, as long as you guys sign up with promo code TheCatch, that link is down below, Underdog is also going to give you guys a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So that's a free NFL Pick 'em for Week 8's action and up to $1,000 on bonus cash when you guys sign up with promo code TheCatch. That link is down below. Next thing that you need to know is that Tyreek Hill is back. Or is he? Because he is listed as questionable going into Week 8 in a smash matchup against the Arizona Cardinals, giving up the 23rd most fantasy points per game. So, Tua Tagovailoa is going to make his NFL return this week. He's been out since that Week 2 concussion that he suffered against Buffalo, but he's going to be back against Arizona. And in theory, that means Tyreek Hill, who's had an awful slump since week 2 should be back outside of week 5 against New England, where he had 12.9 fantasy points. He's had 8.2 fantasy points or less. This was a top 3, top 4, top 5 draft pick in all drafts this season, and he should be back. But what if he's not? What do we do with Tyreek Hill, this Miami Dolphins offense? Well, if he doesn't play, then there's nothing that we can do, but that's going to open up things for Jaylen Waddle, who also has had an extreme slump since week 2, but did have 16.2 fantasy points in week 1, similar to how Tyreek Hill had 26 fantasy points in week 1, albeit they played the Jacksonville Jaguars, a team we just talked about having arguably the worst defense in the entire NFL. But here's what I'm going to say. Tua's back. I don't know if he has a crazy high ceiling, but the matchup for Tua today is absolutely fantastic, as the Cardinals have been in the bottom 5 against opposing quarterbacks in terms of fantasy points allowed. And we look back to last week, like it looked like the Cardinals defense played pretty well, but come on, they were playing the Chargers, and they still allowed 349 passing yards to Justin Herbert. The Chargers just could not finish drives for whatever reason against the Cardinals, who have been very bad on the season overall. So if you own Tyreek Hill, as long as he's active, as long as he plays today, you have to start him. The upside's too high. I still have got questions out there about some of you guys wanting to potentially bench Tyreek Hill, scared of, kind of this first game back. How do things look? Things are going to be okay. If you own Hill, the upside is way too high to bench him, and I still think Jaylen Waddle is a solid flex option this week. And if Hill is out, that just elevates Jaylen Waddle's overall status for today. It makes him a good starting option. If you own Devon Achane, by the way, the Cardinals have also heavily struggled against the run, so we should be able to fire up offensive starters for the Miami Dolphins today. Let's hope that Tyreek Hill is healthy and good to go here in week 8. All right, next thing that you need to know is that this New Orleans Saints run defense is just getting drastically worse and worse, and becoming one of the worst run defenses in the entire NFL. Javonte Williams just absolutely shredded this defense last Thursday. 26.1 fantasy points for Javonte Williams in week 7. I guess that was 2 Thursdays ago, but you guys know what I was saying. 88 yards on the ground, 2 rushing touchdowns, and added 3 catches for 23 receiving yards. The week before that, Bucky Irving absolutely shredded the Saints defense. 81 yards on the ground, a touchdown, 2 catches for 24 receiving yards. And oh yeah, in that same game, Sean Tucker had 34.2 fantasy points, 136 yards on the ground, a touchdown, 3 receptions for 56 receiving yards, and an additional receiving touchdown. Well, my boy Rachaad White was on the bench. And guess what? The week before that was Kareem Hunt's first game back on the season, or excuse me, his second game back on the season, and he just had 102 rushing yards in that game, a touchdown, 15 receiving yards, and 18.7 fantasy points. So that is a ridiculous amount of fantasy points allowed by the Saints defense in the past couple weeks. So let's look at J.K. Dobbins, who's coming off of a very poor performance and a good matchup at home, or excuse me, on the road. Sorry, I'm botching things here. On the road against the Arizona Cardinals, just 9.6 fantasy points, 14 touches, 40 yards on the ground, 2.86 yards per carry, 3 catches for 26 receiving yards. But he's still averaging 14.7 fantasy points so far on the season, and this matchup is way too good to ignore. Even if you have some depth at the running back position, you have other options you believe in, you can't bench J.K. Dobbins today. He is still seeing all of the volume in this offense. Kamani Vidal, just 3 touches and 1 catch last week against the Cardinals, and Hassan Haskins, 2 total touches. This is J.K. Dobbins' backfield. The upside is massive this week. We could see a 20-plus fantasy point day for J.K. Dobbins at home against the Saints. Do not leave him on your bench as we move into week 8. Thing that you need to know is that there is growing concern for T. Higgins not being able to play today, as he is dealing with a quad injury, and he is going to be a true game time decision. Now, luckily, this is a 1 o'clock game against the Eagles, so we should know before kickoff. We might even know by the time that you were watching this video, but this is a smash matchup for the Bengals wide receivers. Jamar Chase obviously going to be in your starting lineup, but if T. Higgins does not play, then Andre Yoshivas becomes a player that we can potentially pick up off of the waiver wire this morning and plug in. He's just rostered in 9% of fantasy leagues right now. And he really hasn't done anything since that little spurt at the beginning of the season where he had 14.7 fantasy points in week 2, 16.2 fantasy points in week 3, and 3 touchdowns in those 2 games. He's had 5.6 or less fantasy points every game since. And we really look at this roster, while there's some other names here, like Trenton Irwin, for example, who's done nothing since week 2. And by nothing, I mean literally 0 fantasy points since. You got rookie Jermaine Burton, who on the season has 1 catch. Charlie Jones, 1 catch on the season as well. The only player who's going to step up here is going to be Yoshi, unless we're looking at like tight end Eric All or more volume to Chase Brown and Zach Moss. But in terms of receiving options against a Philadelphia Eagles defense that struggles against the pass, a little bit better last week, but ultimately struggles against the pass, is better against the run. Yoshi might be a flex option if T. Higgins does not play today and you are desperate and need to plug in a player last minute in the flex. Thing that you need to know that I try to remind you guys of each and every single week, that maybe we don't need to go over every week at this point, but I'm going to let you guys know that the Carolina Panthers still have the worst run defense in the entire NFL, just getting absolutely gassed on a weekly basis. They have given up a touchdown to the running back position in every single game so far on the season. And this week they get Javonte Williams, who we mentioned earlier in the video, coming off a massive performance, his best fantasy day of the season with 26.1 fantasy points, 88 yards on the ground, 2 rushing touchdowns, 23 receiving yards off of 3 receptions. Javonte Williams, I mean, he still kind of comes in as one of these players that might be on your bench, might be, your RB3 or your RB4 that might not always make your starting lineup. It's this simple. This is the worst run defense in the NFL. They're giving up the most fantasy points to the running back position by a mile. Javonte Williams is a must-start player in this matchup at home against the Panthers. We got Bryce Young as the starting quarterback. The Denver Broncos defense with Pat Surtain back are going to be absolutely humming. They were absolutely humming in week 7 against the Saints and Spencer Rattler without Patrick Surtain. This is going to be a play defense, run the football game first and foremost for the Broncos. Bo Nix can certainly do some things in this game, especially since he can run, and we'll see what Troy Franklin, who I do think is sneaky this week, can do, and what Cortland Sutton can do. But ultimately, this is going to be a run-first offensive game plan, and Javonte Williams is set for a massive performance in Week 8, just like he had in Week 7. Do not bench Javonte Williams as we move into Week 8. And almost every single week, we head straight over to Underdog, and whatever running back is facing the Panthers' run defense, we take the over on them to score a touchdown. So I would head straight to Underdog, take Javonte Williams to score a touchdown, and don't forget, new users who sign up with promo code TheCatch with the link down below are going to get that free NFL Pick 'em for the week. Take your free Pick 'em. Take Javonte to score a touchdown against the Panthers. Once he does, you're going to triple your cash entry. And on top of that, Underdog is also going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So claim your free pick'em and claim that deposit match with promo code TheCatch. And that link is down below. Next thing that you need to know is that Russell Wilson had a great first start with the Pittsburgh Steelers with 24.8 fantasy points, 16 of 29, a little shaky there at the beginning, but it turned out okay. 264 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, and added a rushing touchdown. And now, here in Week 8, on Sunday night, he's going to face the New York Giants. They are giving up the 25th most fantasy points to the quarterback position so far on the season. So, why do I want to talk about this? Well, I mean, first and foremost, I think, and I'm sorry, it's Monday Night Football, not Sunday Night Football. As soon as I said that, I was like, I think that's wrong. But on Monday Night Football, he'll face the Giants, who give up the 25th most fantasy points to the quarterback position. And yeah, I do think Russell Wilson is a solid streaming option this week. He sits at 30% rostered. We talked about this in yesterday's video. You need somebody to pick up. Russell Wilson is a viable play at the quarterback position and is a solid starter in Superflex and double quarterback formats today. But the Steelers will get a bye week in Week 9. So let's say Russell Wilson has a solid performance, 17, 18 fantasy points, or let's say he has a good performance and scores 20 plus fantasy points, or let's say maybe he doesn't have the best fantasy performance. Either way, I think he'll be available in a lot of leagues because the Steelers have a week 9 bye week. And then after that, they just have such a solid strength of schedule. The Washington Commanders, the Baltimore Ravens, the Cleveland Browns, the Cincinnati Bengals, the Cleveland Browns again, the Philadelphia Eagles, the Baltimore Ravens. It is a bad matchup in week 17 in the fantasy championship against the Chiefs. But everything outside of that, we have good game scripts. We have soft defenses against the quarterback and the wide receiver position for the most part. And then we have a couple good run defenses in there that are going to force the Steelers to have to throw the football. So as long as Russell Wilson stays healthy and is the starting quarterback for the Steelers, who are right there in the mix as one of the best teams in the AFC, whether we want to admit that or not, they have won a tremendous amount of football games so far throughout the season. Now, they got a lot of divisional matchups coming up here. 2 games against Baltimore, 1 game against Cincinnati, and then 2 games against Cleveland as well. So that's going to be a big factor. But that's kind of the point here. They're going to be in these game scripts where they want to and need to win football games. And I guarantee you, by the end of the season, they're going to be right there in the spot at worst to be fighting for a wild card spot. So we want these competitive matchups when it comes to fantasy football one way or another. So I think now is a time to pick up Russell Wilson, hold on to him. If you're struggling at the quarterback position, you got Patrick Mahomes, you got Anthony Richardson, especially if you're in, I mean, he's probably not available in as many super flex or double quarterback leagues, but still, overall, if you're hurting at the quarterback position, Jayden Daniels is banged up. You just got Tua coming back. You're uncertain how you feel about him. Whatever it is. Maybe you're strong at quarterback and you want to keep him away from your opposing league mates. That's okay too. Russell Wilson, I think, should be rostered in a higher amount of fantasy leagues at this point in time with that schedule that's coming up after week 8. Last thing that you need to know is that David Njoku should be in line for a big game this week. Last week, we talked about Cade Otton going into week 8. We also talked a lot about Hunter Henry and Zach Ertz due to their matchups. But the main reason we talked about Cade Otton was because the matchup against the Baltimore Ravens was very favorable, but also the game script was favorable. And then it just worked out that Mike Evans essentially missed the whole game, and that led to more targets for Cade Otton. But back to the point here, David Njoku gets the Baltimore Ravens, who are giving up the 26th most fantasy points to the tight end position so far on the season. And what exactly are we going to get out of the Browns today? I don't know. Jerry Jeudy had a very high percentage of first read looks out of Jameis Winston last week, but then Cedric Tillman really came away as the wide receiver who had the best fantasy day with 12 targets, 8 receptions, 81 receiving yards, and 18 fantasy points. And then don't forget, Elijah Moore had 6 targets, 6 receptions, 41 receiving yards, and 10.1 fantasy points. But then, David Njoku included with the wide receivers, we saw, some of those passes come from Deshaun Watson, some from Dorian Thompson-Robinson, then some from Jameis Winston. So we kind of got a mixed bag here. But at the end of the day, this is a great matchup against the Ravens, and maybe this Browns offense, this Browns team as a whole, comes out with a different perspective today with a different starting quarterback, right? But the point being is that the Ravens have struggled against opposing quarterbacks, they've struggled against opposing wide receivers, and they've struggled against opposing tight ends. They haven't really struggled against the running back position. They've been very good in terms of a run defense, but even last week we saw Bucky Irving and Rachaad White score a fair amount of fantasy points against the Ravens, to say the least. So it's a home game for the Browns, and I think at the end of the day, the most consistent offensive player today is going to be David Njoku, who had 14 targets, 10 receptions, 76 receiving yards, a touchdown, and 23.6 fantasy points in Week 7 against the Bengals. So if you own David Njoku, fire him up. This matchup is way too good to ignore. I think at the end of the day, he's going to be the security blanket for Jameis Winston and be a big part of this offensive game plan as we move in to Sunday's action today in Week 8. That'll do it for today's video. There are 10 things you need to know before we get into Week 8 of the 2024 fantasy football season. So don't forget, guys, I will answer every single comment on this video. If you guys need anything whatsoever moving into Week 8 of the season, drop me a comment down below and I'll get every single question answered before kickoff today. And on top of that, guys, we have everything you could possibly need here on the channel for Week 8 of 2024 fantasy football. Start sits at every single position, must start defenses, kicker rankings, buy low targets, players that you can't bench, last minute waiver wire additions, sneaky starts, all kinds of content to help you guys bring home a dub in week 8 of 2024 fantasy football. So make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel so that you don't miss out on any of the content. And with that, I'll say good luck today. Here in week 8 of the season. I can't believe we're already in week 8. The season is flying by. And of course, thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.